So I think we get started again. I'm very proud to present my dear colleague and friend Amy Allen to you. Amy Allen is a professor for philosophy and gender studies at Penn State University. She used to be at Dartmouth University, and among her various publications, I'm only mentioning To the End of Progress, which is something that today will come up again, and just recently The Critique on the Couch. And Amy is actually just comes from a tour where she has been promoting the German translation of The Critique on the Couch. She is one of the most prominent and important voices in contemporary critical theory, and I'm very happy to have you and to listen to your talk.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Rahel, and thanks to Thomas Karana for the invitation to join this wonderful conference. So the title of my talk, Universality, Necessity, and Progress, Marx and the Problem of History, is perhaps a bit misleading because it suggests that there is one single problem of history in Marx, when in fact, I think we could say that there are several. So first of all, does Marx even have a theory of history? And if so, what is that theory? And whatever that theory of history is it a view that he maintained consistently over the course of his life? Or is it a youthful indiscretion, a hangover of Hegelian humanism that he later outgrew? By attributing a theory of history to him, are we refusing to allow him to grow up, as Althusser put it? Relatedly, what role, if any, does this theory of history play in Marx's mature critique of capitalism as articulated in Capital Volume 1? Second, was Marx committed to a universal history in the tradition of Kant and Hegel? Does he maintain that there is only one single line of historical development, from feudalism through capitalism to socialism? Or was this simplistic stadial model a fiction created and sustained by the extensive editorial work that gave us texts like the German Ideology? Even if he did hold such a view early in his life, did he later move decisively away from it? For example, in his late ethnological notebooks, his journalistic writings, and his reflections on the Russian Commune, and embrace instead a vision of multiple diverse historical pathways and trajectories? And if so, what are the implications of such a move? Is Marx's theory of history deterministic or fatalistic? Was he overly confident about the necessity or the inevitability of the collapse of capitalism? And if so, what's the source of that confidence? And what, if anything, does the fall of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe tell us about that view of history? That Marx was wrong? Or rather that, as Jerry Cohen suggested, we might just have to wait longer for the historical process to play out. After all, feudalism lasted for 1,000 years. Or is the picture of a deterministic Marx just a caricature created by the Marxists of the Second International, one that has no or very little relation to Marx's actual views? And finally, was Marx's theory of history triumphalist? Was he too wedded to Enlightenment ideas of historical progress? Did he, in fact, think that, for all its flaws, capitalism went hand in hand with modernity, and that both were instances of civilizational progress over more so-called primitive or barbaric forms of life? Or is this also a view that he gave up over time, eventually landing on a conception of capitalism as itself barbaric, a form of hell on earth? So I take it that these are the major problems of history that emerge from Marx's work. And you might be wondering why I'm interested in revisiting this well-traveled and very hotly contested territory. The primary reason is that I take it that contemporary critical theory needs, among other things, an account of capitalism and its interrelation with the ongoing legacies of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery in order to offer a compelling critique of the present. And the question that I'm interested in is this: to what extent does Marx's theory of history constitute an impediment to developing such a project with Marxist resources? In other words, how can the critique of capitalism and the theory of history be disentangled in Marx's work? Can we return to Marx now to reanimate his critique of capitalism, as I think so many scholars and activists are interested in doing these days, without perhaps unwittingly taking on board some of his philosophical historical commitments? So I won't pretend to be able to answer all of those questions in this brief talk this afternoon, but I want to make a start by first briefly rehearsing what I take to be the best and one of the most influential post-colonial critiques of Marxist theory of history, the one articulated by Dipesh Chakrabarty. And I have to say, Rahel and I did not plan this actually for these two talks to be mirror images in a way of each other, but that's kind of how it's working out. So I'm going to start with Chakrabarty because I think he poses in a particularly compelling and rigorous way sort of the challenge of the Marxist theory of history and how to think colonialism and capitalism together using Marxist resources. Next, I'll consider an influential revisionist interpretation of Marx that aims to respond to the post-colonial critique. This revisionist interpretation argues that in his late work, Marx abandons his earlier problematically Eurocentric view of history in favor of a view that emphasizes multilinear, contingent, and only ambivalently progressive historical trajectories. And finally, I'll assess that revisionist interpretation. My strategy for doing so will be to revisit the problems of universality, necessity, and progress, and to argue that although all three are combined in Marx's early work, they can be disaggregated. Thus, even if we are convinced that Marx embraces a multilinear view of history in his late work, it does not follow from this that he has therefore given up his entire theory of history. One can understand history as multilinear and at the same time as evincing, in some sense, a necessary and progressive developmental logic. And something like this, I take it, is Marx's mature view. Okay, so I start with a brief revisiting of the post-colonial, or at least one strand of the post-colonial critique of Marx. As Nikita Dewan has argued in her contribution to Marx from the Margins, the post-colonial critique of Marx centers on his theory of history, with the core issue being the Eurocentric nature of Marx's theory of historical progress or development. An early and extremely influential version of this critique was offered by Edward Said in his field-defining classic, Orientalism. Citing Marx's qualified defense of British colonial rule in India from an 1853 New York Daily Tribune article, Said points out that while Marx describes colonialism's destruction of, quote, the entire framework of Indian society as sickening, end quote, he nevertheless reminds his reader of two things. First, that those traditional social structures were themselves, as Marx puts it, the foundation of Oriental despotism, rooted in superstition and bound up with systems of caste and slavery. And second, that their annihilation is necessary for what Marx calls, quote, the fundamental revolution in the social state of Asia that is necessary for humanity to fulfill its destiny, end quote. As Said reads him, Marx not only deems Indian society to be despotic and therefore backward, and indeed in this article, Marx does describe Indian villages as, quote, semi-barbarian, semi-civilized communities, and he refers to their form of life as, quote, undignified, stagnatory, and vegetative, end quote. So he not only sees Indian society as despotic and therefore backward, he also understands British colonialism in messianic terms, whereby the Orient becomes nothing more than what Said calls, quote, an element in a redemptive project, end quote. Thus, Said concludes that, quote, even though Marx's humanity, his sympathy for the misery of people are clearly engaged, his economic analyses are perfectly fitted to a standard Orientalist undertaking, end quote. Now, although this line of critique has been taken up by a wide range of post-colonial theorists, it has arguably been most fully developed and most powerfully articulated by Dipesh Chakrabarty in his book, Provincializing Europe. Foundational to Chakrabarty's argument is his critique of historicism, which is a term that Chakrabarty uses to describe a particular way of thinking about history that is central to both the discipline of history and to the Marxist tradition. Historicism is a polysemic and contested term but Chakrabarty understands it as a view that holds the following, quote, "In order to understand the nature of anything in this world, we must see it as an historically developing entity, that is, first as an individual and unique whole, as some kind of unity, at least in potentia, and second, as something that develops over time," end quote. Historicism entails not only a specific understanding of the past, but also a relationship to the future. For the historicist, history is, Chakrabarty writes, quote, "a developmental process in which that which is possible becomes actual by tending to a future that is singular," end quote. In other words, historicism posits a future of which we know at least the constitutive principles, even if we do not have a blueprint for it. Chakrabarty calls this the future that will be. Connecting his critique of historicism to its roots in Foucauldian genealogy and in anti-colonial thought, Chakrabarty emphasizes its political point, the political point of the critique of historicism, which is to show how historicist thinking supports, quote, "a theory of modernity in which some people claim to have been modern before others and use this claim to justify their domination of those they consider less evolved," end quote. Now, as I mentioned, Chakrabarty contends that historicist thinking is central to the Marxist tradition. Indeed, that the historicist perspective is built into Marxist critique of capital. Marxist critiques of capitalism understand capital as Chakrabarty writes, quote, "a unity that arises in one part of the world at a particular period and then develops globally over historical time, encountering and negotiating historical differences in the process," end quote. Crucially for Chakrabarty, this claim holds no matter how complex or internally differentiated this unity is, which means that he understands his critique to apply equally to theories of combined and uneven development. Indeed, Chakrabarty reads such theories as ways that Western Marxism acknowledges the differential spread of capitalism across the globe, while, quote, "retaining the idea of a general historical movement from a pre-modern stage to that of modernity," end quote. Indeed, without such an assumption, there would be no way for such theories to deem certain formations as anachronistic or developments as incomplete. So such theories, Chakrabarty suggests, acknowledge historical difference without allowing it to make a difference. Despite its historicism, however, Chakrabarty also insists that Marx's critique of capitalism is utterly central to the critique of imperialism and to the tradition of anti-imperial thought. As he puts the point, quote, "Marx's writings constitute one of the founding moments in the history of anti-imperial thought." Moreover, Marxist anti-imperialist thought doesn't just sit alongside the historicist theory of history. Marx turns his idea of history, Chakrabarty writes, into a critical tool for understanding modern European imperialism. And this critical tool has had a transformative impact on South Asian intellectual traditions. Indeed, as Chakrabarty notes, quote, "the project of subaltern studies would have been unthinkable without the vibrant tradition of Marxist historiography in India," end quote. Hence the deeply paradoxical nature of Marx's legacy from the post-colonial point of view. It offers what we might call an epistemically imperialist critique of imperialism. The point of Chakrabarty's critique, then, is not at all to reject Marx or Marxism, but rather, I take it, to explore possibilities for disentangling the Marxist critique of imperialism from its commitments to historicism. And this requires for Chakrabarty a more radical questioning of Marx's theory of history than can be found in theories of combined and uneven development. Indeed, it requires, as Chakrabarty puts it, quote, "radically questioning the nature of historical time," end quote. In other words, the aim of Chakrabarty's critique of historicism is precisely to open up Marxist narratives of capitalist modernity to issues of historical difference. And the question is, or anyway, the main question I'm interested in this paper is, what precisely does this opening up demand of us and of the way that we understand history? So let me turn next to the revisionist, what I'm calling the revisionist reading of Marx. In recent years, a new wave of Marx scholarship has emerged in response to the post-colonial critique of Marx's Eurocentrism. Unlike those Marxist scholars who simply reject the post-colonial critique outright on the grounds that it rests on incoherent, self-undermining, or politically problematic premises, or on account of its association with a postmodern culturalism, these scholars have returned to Marx's work to contest the interpretation of Marx's theory of history on which the postcolonial critique rests. One of the best, and as far as I can tell, most influential examples of this work is Kevin Anderson's 2010 book, Marx at the Margins. There are also, though, important works by Max Tomba, by Harry Haratunian, some papers by Peter Hudis. So I think there's a whole kind of range of scholarship that's making similar moves here. Now, although Anderson does not respond to Chakrabarty's argument directly, in fact, with the exception of a very brief discussion of Said, Anderson's book doesn't discuss the work of any postcolonial theorists. He explicitly frames his project as a broad rejoinder to postcolonial critiques of the Eurocentric nature of Marx's theory of history. And indeed, this is, I think, how it's often interpreted as well. Now, to Anderson's credit, in my view, he doesn't attempt to dodge the Eurocentrism issue by accusing those who make it with being anti-Enlightenment reactionaries or post-structuralist ideologues, or both. Instead, he takes the concern seriously, acknowledging that, at least with respect to some of Marx's early writings, the charge of Eurocentrism does stick. This includes texts such as the Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels repeatedly evoke and thus seemingly endorse, although it's a little complicated, the association of civilization with the West and so-called barbarianism with the East, and the opening pages of which extol the achievements of capitalist modernity, principally its dismantling of traditional social, religious, and familial hierarchies, and its massive expansion of the forces of production, rooted in technological improvements in communication and manufacturing. As such, Anderson admits the Communist Manifesto reads the development of capitalism in the West in progressive terms as a historical achievement. And it's this reading, in turn, that informs Marx's qualified defense of British colonialism in India in his 1853 article, The British Rule in India, which I mentioned briefly a moment ago. In that text, Marx adopts a progressive reading of colonial rule, emphasizing its long-run benefits for the colonized. And yet, contra Said, Anderson highlights the qualified nature of that defense, which he reads as evidence of an emerging ambivalence in Marx's account of capitalism's progressive features. Whereas the Communist Manifesto offered what Anderson calls, quote, an enthusiastic evocation of capitalist progress, end quote, the 1853 article evinces, quote, a shifting perspective on the progressiveness of capitalism, of its short and long-term benefits to human emancipation, end quote. Having closely observed the effects of capitalism on India, Anderson argues Marx was more attentive to its horrific destructiveness, even if he still maintained that the transition to capitalism was in some sense necessary and would ultimately be beneficial for India. Indeed, in his article, even as Marx describes Indian village life as despotic, vegetative, and stagnant, he also characterizes British rule as vile, stupid, destructive, sickening, and even criminal. Thus, although Anderson admits that the 1853 article adopts what he calls an uncritically modernist perspective that defends the ultimate progressiveness of British imperialism in India, he also reads this piece as marking a turning point in Marx's thought, after which he becomes much less sanguine about capitalism's progressive tendencies. So based on his reading of these early texts, Anderson distinguishes two, as he calls them, problematically Eurocentric notions at work in Marx. The first is a claim about the unilinearity of capitalist development, namely the claim that all societies are destined to follow the same pathway as the West, namely that of capitalist development. The second is a claim about the progressive nature of the process of capitalist modernization. While largely granting the postcolonial critique of Marx's early work, Anderson insists that what Marx's postcolonial critics miss is an appreciation of how his views changed over time. In his early works, including The German Ideology, The Communist Manifesto, and the preface to The Critique of Political Economy, Marx is, Anderson claims, committed to a unilinear, progressive, and Eurocentric theory of history. However, in his late work, he rejects this theory in favor of a more complex view that recognizes multilinear historical trajectories and understands capitalist progress in more ambivalent and contradictory terms. So Anderson's argument is based, I think, on a very impressive mastery of Marx's oeuvre in its entirety, including his journalistic and political writings, letters, unpublished notebooks, and revisions to the French edition of Capital Volume 1. Indeed, Anderson argues convincingly that Marx's late work is much more attentive to colonialism, slavery, race, ethnicity, and the economic structures of non-Western societies than his earlier and published writings, and that his earlier qualified defense of colonialism gives way to a staunch anti-colonialism in Marx's later writings. However, I think it's worth noting that this argument by itself is not at all responsive to the problem of historicism as Chakrabarty frames it. Indeed, as Chakrabarty acknowledges, the critique of imperialism and colonialism and the commitment to historicism can very easily go hand in hand and quite often have done so. So I take it that the important question is not, was Marx himself a critic of colonialism, but rather, did Marx in fact reject the unilinearity and progressiveness of his early view of history? And if so, what are the implications of this shift in his thinking? So I'll consider the two shifts that Anderson charts in turn. First, his claim about the shift from a unilinear to a multilinear understanding of capitalist development starts with the Grundrisse, where Marx famously introduces the Asiatic mode of production. Anderson contends that whereas the German ideology sketches out a unilinear model of historical development from tribal to ancient to feudal to bourgeois societies, the Grundrisse and the 1859 preface evince a more complex account of historical development. In this more complex account, Marx identifies not one, but three early communal forms of pre-capitalist society: Asiatic, Greco-Roman, and Germanic. And moreover, these are not arranged in any sort of stadial model of history. Rather, Marx seems to understand them as part of a multilinear framework with alternative historical trajectories. Further evidence for the emergence of a multilinear perspective is derived from the French edition of Capital Volume 1, the last edition that Marx himself prepared for publication. In this edition, the infamous sentence that is found in the German and English versions, quote, "The country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future," end quote, becomes the following, quote, "The country that is more developed industrially only shows to those that follow it on the industrial path the image of its own future," end quote. This revised formulation, Anderson points out, leaves open the possibility of alternative historical trajectories for societies like Russia and India that had not yet begun to industrialize. Similarly, Anderson highlights the way that the account of primitive accumulation is introduced in the editions of Capital that were edited by Engels, where the story of the enclosure of the commons in England is presented as the only example of the so-called classic form of this process, implying that England is the paradigm case of a, quote, "global and unilinear process of capitalist development," end quote. In the French edition, by contrast, Marx made it clear that the scope of his discussion of primitive accumulation is confined to Western Europe, and that the process will unfold differently in different contexts. Again, this alteration in the text allows for the possibility that non-capitalist countries might follow their own distinctive historical trajectories, and it also shows, according to Anderson, that Marx's account of primitive accumulation was not intended to offer a grand global narrative, but was instead meant as nothing more than a description of development in Western Europe. Now, as Anderson makes clear, Marx's reconsideration of his unilinear account of history was to a great extent inspired by his extensive and detailed attempts to make sense of the political situation in Russia. Thus, Anderson's argument culminates in his discussion of Marx's late writings on Russia from the period of 1877 to 1882. Particularly important texts in this regard include Marx's 1877 response to Mikhailovsky and the various drafts of his letter to the Russian revolutionary Vera Zazulush. In these texts, Marx bristles at Mikhailovsky's suggestion that he endorses a unilinear theory of historical development. In his reply, Marx insists that his is not, quote, "a general historico-philosophical theory that offers the master key to all of human history." Mikhailovsky, Marx contends, misreads him when he, quote, "insists on transforming my historical sketch of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe into a historico-philosophical theory of the general course fatally imposed on all peoples," end quote. Moreover, in these texts, Marx is quite open to the idea that Russia might skip over the capitalist stage of development and proceed directly from its agrarian peasant society to socialism, a claim associated with Russian populism that Marx had previously rejected out of hand. However, as Anderson notes, there are some important caveats to this point. If Russia is able to skip over capitalist modernization and move directly to socialism, this will only be because it is able to draw on what Marx calls, quote, the highest achievements of capitalist modernity, end quote, and to do so without having to fall victim to its destructive downsides. Relatedly, Russia could avail itself of those achievements only by linking up with working class revolutions in the West, which would allow it to, quote, gain access on a cooperative basis to the fruits of Western modernity, end quote. So Anderson summarizes his reading of these late writings as follows. In them, Marx denies, quote, 1, that he had created a unilinear theory of history, 2, that he worked with a deterministic model of social development, or 3, that Russia in particular was bound to evolve in the manner of Western capitalism, end quote. And so it's interesting, I think, and worth noticing how Anderson seems to assume here that the shift to a multilinear framework kills two birds with one stone, leaving both unilinearity and the problem of historical determinism or necessity behind. I'll come back to that point in a moment. With respect to progress, I've already indicated the basic outlines of Anderson's argument. While he admits that Marx's early writings evince a problematically Eurocentric notion of progress, Anderson suggests that over time, Marx's account becomes more complex, contradictory, ambivalent, and dialectical. And he gives some examples of this, I think, that I'll skip over in the interest of time. I'm guessing many of you are familiar with some of his late writings on articles on China, and of course the account of primitive accumulation in Capital Volume 1, which is quite ambivalent and which has already been referenced earlier. In talking about that discussion, though, I want to highlight that Anderson contends that it's not even clear that Marx believed that the main form of primitive accumulation, the case of uprooting peasant production in Europe, brought about social progress. And Anderson contends that there is, quote, only a single brief acknowledgement of progress in this part of the text. And I think that's pretty misleading, actually, but I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So to sum up, although Anderson initially identifies two problematically Eurocentric features of the theory of history laid out in Marx's early work, unilinearity and progress, his argument ultimately encompasses a third feature as well, historical necessity. His main contention is that Marx's later work is marked not only by a greater attentiveness to the problems of slavery and colonialism in relation to capitalism and to the non-Western world more generally, but also, and relatedly, a shift to a multilinear and non-deterministic understanding of historical development and a contradictory and ambivalent account of progress. So this brings me to the main argument that I want to make, which is that Anderson does not, I think, sufficiently disentangle three distinct aspects of Marx's theory of history: universality, necessity, and progress. And as a result, he makes too much of the emergence of a multilinear understanding of historical development in Marx's late work. As interesting and consequential as Marx's late rejection of a unilinear theory of history may be, it does not necessarily commit him to rejecting his claims about historical necessity or progress. I also take it, I don't really spell this out, but that it's the claim about progress that actually is, from the post-colonial point of view, the most contentious. So, but maybe we can talk about that. So to see why this is the case, let's take a closer look at each of these three aspects of Marx's theory of history, starting with universality. To say that Marx ascribes universality to history, I take it, is to say that he maintains that all societies follow a single, universally applicable historical path or developmental trajectory. So notice that on this way of thinking about universality, I think that universality and unilinearity amount to the same thing, namely that there is one single developmental path or historical trajectory that all societies must follow. To say that Marx ascribes necessity to history is to say that he maintains that the movement along this historical trajectory is in some sense necessary or inevitable. Of course, there are different ways of spelling out what that means. We've already heard some discussion of that today. And importantly, as Rahel was emphasizing in her talk, there are two sides of a necessity claim, or two versions of a necessity claim that one can find in Marx's work. One that emphasizes the objective crisis-ridden process of development and expansion of the forces of production, and another that focuses more on the subjective side of the historical antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie that will lead to a revolutionary upheaval. Finally, to say that Marx holds a progressive theory of history is to say that he views the necessary unfolding of this unilinear historical path to be a progressive process in both technological, economic, and normative political senses. Note, however, that because history develops through the generation and resolution of crises, antagonisms, and contradictions, the progressive nature of capitalist modernization is deeply ambivalent. Now, although I've just presented these three aspects of Marx's theory of history as interconnected, and although all three of these elements are combined in Marx's early work, they can, I think, be potentially disaggregated and combined in different ways, such that rejecting one of them doesn't necessarily entail rejecting the other two. I think that all three of these aspects of the view are presented as a package in Marx's 1859 preface to the Critique of Political Economy. I won't cite the passage here because it's very long, and I presume many of you are already familiar with it, but it's the passage that begins with the words, quote, "In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations," et cetera, et cetera. What we find in this passage is a clear invocation of a universal unilinear model of history as a succession of stages from Asiatic through Asian and feudal to modern bourgeois capitalist modes of production, a reference to the historical necessity of this process in the sense of the relations of production becoming fetters on the expansion of the forces of production, thereby giving rise to social revolution. And the passage ends with a clear statement that this process of development from one stage to another constitutes, quote, progress in the economic development of society. Okay, so how is it possible then to disaggregate these three claims if they, in fact, all come together in Marx's work? It seems plausible, I think, to say that universality entails necessity. After all, if there's only one universally valid path or trajectory to history, then it would seem to follow that every society, insofar as it develops at all, must necessarily follow that same path. That said, universality, understood as unilinearity, need not entail a claim about progress. One can easily imagine a universal or unilinear history that is at the same time negative or regressive. And Adorno's universal history running from the slingshot to the atomic bomb would perhaps be one example of this. Moreover, and most importantly for my purposes, rejecting the universality claim doesn't necessarily entail rejecting either of the other two. A theory of history could be multilinear and contingent while still understanding history in progressive or developmental terms. I take it that something like this is the structure of Habermas's theory of social evolution, although that's debatable, I suppose, we could discuss. Or a theory could be multilinear while still making claims about the necessity or inevitability of certain historical developments and about their progressive character. And I take it that that's Marx's mature view. Maybe it's also Rahel Yegi's. I'm not sure. We can talk about that too. So even if Anderson argues convincingly that Marx moves toward a multilinear rather than a unilinear theory in his late work, this does not entail that he rejects claims to historical necessity or progress. Moreover, when we look at the late letters on Russia that Anderson quotes extensively, we see a Marx who remains committed to his earlier ideas, both of historical inevitability and of progress. For example, in the famed letter to Zazulich, Marx cites the passage from the French edition of Capital, Volume 1, where he limits the scope of his account of primitive accumulation, and then goes on to say, quote, "The historical inevitability of this course is therefore explicitly restricted to the countries of Western Europe," end quote. So there's a restriction in scope, but a reassertion of some kind of historical necessity or inevitability. Similarly, in the preliminary drafts of his letter to Zazulich, he emphasizes both the specificity of the Russian situation and his commitment to the progressive nature of capitalist modernity. As he writes, quote, "Thanks to the unique combination of circumstances in Russia, the rural commune, already established on a national scale, may gradually shake off its primitive characteristics and directly develop as an element of collective production on a national scale. Precisely because it is contemporaneous with capitalist production, the rural commune may appropriate for itself all the positive achievements, and this without undergoing its frightful vicissitudes," end quote. Okay, so as I mentioned a few minutes ago, then if Marx insists that if Russia is able to follow a different historical path, this will only be because it can draw on and incorporate the positive achievements of capitalist modernity. Now, the position that's staked out in these late letters is, I think, consistent with the argument of the penultimate chapter of Capital, Volume 1, where Marx reiterates the progress and inevitability claims, but without restating the universality or unilinearity claim. And this is kind of a long quote, which I'm sure many of you know, but I'm going to read it anyway. Quote, "Along with the constant decrease in the number of capitalist magnates who usurp and monopolize all the advantages of this process of transformation, the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, and exploitation grows. But with this, there also grows the revolt of the working class, a class constantly increasing in numbers and trained, united, and organized by the very mechanism of the capitalist mode of process of production. The monopoly of capitalism becomes a fetter upon the mode of production which has flourished alongside and under it. The centralization of the means of production and the socialization of labor reach a point at which they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. Thus, capitalist production begets, with the inexorability of a natural process, its own negation. This is the negation of the negation. It does not reestablish private property, but it does indeed establish individual property on the basis of the achievements of the capitalist era, namely cooperation and the possession in common of the land and the means of production produced by labor itself." End quote. So here I think we can see clear references both to the way that Marx understands historical necessity, the inexorability of a natural process, the references to the expansion of the forces of production and the emergence of a revolutionary class, and also to progress, to the achievements of the capitalist era. And this brings me to a more general point about Marx's view of progress. So I mentioned that Anderson contends that the shift from an enthusiastic account of capitalist modernity in his early work, that Marx shifts from an enthusiastic account of capitalist modernity in his early work to a more contradictory, ambivalent, and dialectical account in his later work. And the problem with this claim is that I think it rests on a misunderstanding of Marx's early account of progress. Progress for Marx, I think, is always ambivalent, even in his early work. Indeed, negativity and destructiveness are precisely what moves progress along for him. Progress is not undermined or undone by the antagonism, force, and negation necessary to achieve it. Rather, in true dialectical fashion, it is achieved through them. As Marx puts the point in Capital, Volume 1, force is the midwife of every old society which is pregnant with a new one. Now, to be sure, one could argue that this negativity is more pronounced in Marx's later work, and it's true that a great many pages of Capital, Volume 1, are devoted to detailing the destructiveness of capitalism. But contra Anderson, I think it's important to note that this negativity is also clearly present in the opening pages of the Communist Manifesto, where all of Marx and Engels' claims about capitalism's achievements are twinned with acknowledgments of its destructive downsides. So dismantling the traditional hierarchies that bind man to his natural superiors gives way to relationships governed by naked self-interest and callous cash payment. Or as they write, quote, "The most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism are, quote, drowned in the icy water of egotistical calculation." Similarly, quote, "The sentimental veil of the family has been torn away, but in the process, it has been reduced to a mere money relation," and so on. In other words, it simply isn't true, as Anderson claims about the manifesto, that entire pages celebrated capitalist progress before Marx and Engels began to talk about contradictions. Nor is it true that their talk of contradictions in that text is limited to the emerging antagonism between the proletariat and bourgeoisie. Conversely, it's worth emphasizing, I think, that even in Capital Volume 1, after cataloging in vivid detail over a great many pages, not only the injustices of capitalist exploitation, but also the brutality and violence of primitive accumulation, Marx can still refer to the achievements of the capitalist era and contend that these serve as the basis for the transition to socialism. So I think it's misleading of Anderson to suggest that Marx ever offered an undialectical and enthusiastic celebration of capitalist progress, and also misleading to suggest that his later work gives up on the idea that certain core achievements of capitalist modernity provide the material and normative basis for a socialist future. Okay, so I have a very brief conclusion. Although I think that Anderson tends to conflate the three elements of Marx's theory of history that I've tried to disarticulate: universality, necessity, and progress. And although I'm not at all convinced by his reading of the role of progress in Marx's work, I do think he makes a convincing textual case for the gradual emergence of a more multilinear understanding of historical development in Marx's late work. And I think this is a common thread in a number of these, what I'm calling revisionist readings of Marx by Tomba and Haratunian and others, the emphasis on multilinearity and multiplicity. But my basic question is this: how significant is this move from unilinearity to multilinearity? First of all, I think we have to consider just how multilinear this late account of history is, in Marx, I mean, especially if, as Anderson admits, Russia can only follow its unique path to socialism by drawing on the achievements of capitalist modernity, and it can only do so in collaboration with proletarian revolutions in Europe. Moreover, this path is only open to it because of some very specific features of Russia's historical and social context, which means it's not at all clear how generalizable Marx takes this case to be. But more generally, and even if we grant that Marx does move to a truly multilinear view of history in his late work, and not just a view that allows for a certain kind of Russian exceptionalism, how significant is this move, specifically with respect to the charge of Eurocentrism put forward by Chakrabarty? Do multilinear accounts of history in and of themselves escape the post-colonial charge of Eurocentrism? Or might they instead evince a kind of all roads lead to the same end logic that leaves the original problem intact? So recall, Chakrabarty's critique of historicism acknowledges that historicist thinking can make room for internal heterogeneity, complexity, and zigzags, so long as these are folded into a broader story of the developing unity or totality. And perhaps for Marx, the developing unity or totality is not capitalism, but rather socialism, in which case the various multilinear strands, in fact, await reincorporation into a longer-run historicist view. If that's true, or plausible even, I think, then perhaps the vexed question of whether and to what extent Marx allows for a plurality of antecedents to capitalism is somewhat beside the point. The crucial issue would be what Chakrabarty describes as historicism's positing of a singular future that will be, and the conflict-ridden, antagonistic, contradictory, yet nonetheless progressive process that inexorably leads to it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have 1,000 questions, but that's not my role. So yeah, you're first, Anton.
Thank you. I want to pick up on the very last point you made because, I mean, as you were talking about progress and necessity in particular, and those as like lingering problems, even if you deal with the multilinearity issue, I was thinking about, communism, like, relative to now, would it be progress? Would communism be progress? I mean, if you say yes, then well, that's something. I mean, sorry. So I mean that's the future. Yeah. So I mean, so now does that saddle me with an objectionable conception of the progressiveness? Okay, good. All right. So if I now here's next step. If I say, it may be possible now. That is this progressive step. But it's only possible now, if it is possible now, because of some things that already happened. And, you know, so I don't know, whatever, they happened in all sorts of different places in all sorts of different ways, but, you know, here's some like highlights, and I tell you some of those things that happened, like the emergence of capitalism, and then give you a kind of story about where it happened and how that, now, I mean, there's still so far, I hope I haven't said anything objectionable by the lights of this criticism. Maybe I have, but let me just offer like a very minimal idea of necessity. I've already got the idea of progress, which is unobjectionable. But now here's an idea of necessity, a very minimal one, that without which something good would not be possible. So. So capitalism did emerge in the past. It's here. If you know, it's only because it did, in whatever detailed way it did, that something good now is possible, and it would be progress for us to go get it. So I've got multilinearity, progress, and necessity. Am I still running afoul of the post-colonial critique?
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, great question. So on, first on progress, I mean, this is certainly debatable, but I think that one does not have to take on board this entire backward-looking way of reading history in order to say that.
Das Mikrofon ist. Hallo?
Sorry. So I think that, and this is something I tried to argue in my book, The End of Progress, that we don't have to take on board an entire backward-looking way of reading history as progressive in order to say that communism or anything else would count as some kind of progress. So, but this is exactly, I take it, the kind of idealist perspective that I think Rahel was trying to argue against in her talk. So, because the whole concept is to try to break apart these two strands of progress, like the way of reading history as progress that I take it is the subject of post-colonial critique, and then the forward-looking sort of aspiration for some sort of progressive change. So that's why I was shaking my head when you were making the question about progress. But to your second question, I mean, I think the worry, I take it, is from the post-colonial point of view that there is a kind of secular theodicy here, right? That if you've got necessity and you've got progress in this way of reading history, that what you end up with is some kind of, even if it's weak and so on, right, justification of a set of historical and social conditions that are actually experienced as relations of domination from the part of people who are colonized. And that's, so I think what I'm trying to ask, the question I'm trying to ask in this paper is, and it's probably at this point really a pretty open question, is like, does giving up the unilinearity claim by itself meet the post-colonial challenge or not? It's not clear to me that it does, because it's not clear to me that you couldn't just, give a multilinear, complex, story that would still be this kind of secular theodicy, and that you'd still then be taking on board that problem. Now, of course, you could say, well, I'm not concerned about this critique, or I have other, response. Like, I think there's different ways you could, sort of push back. But I think I'm starting from the assumption that this is a critique that's worth taking seriously. And then the question is, what are the, resources within Marx's work for interpreting him in a way that's responsive to it? And I'll just say one more thing, which is that I don't think, even if I don't think that Marx necessarily himself has great resources for responding to all of the force of the post-colonial critique, I would say that that's an interesting problem that's been taken up in the Marxist tradition in important ways. So I'm really restricting myself in this paper just to Marx's theory of history. It's a separate question, like to what extent other Marxists have creatively responded to this issue.
Thank you so much. I have a very short question, just perhaps a clarificatory one, about the claim about necessity. And we talked throughout this conference of enabling conditions, right? So I guess then my question was, so I see a way of construing the claim for necessity as there are some enabling conditions for the rise of communism. And if I frame the claim in those terms, it doesn't seem to me that, it seems to me that it's possible that there are many different sets of enabling conditions. Like it's not necessary that there's just one set that will make that possible. And I guess that my question is, do you take Marx to actually have the strong claim of there's just one specific set of enabling conditions that will actually make communism emerge, or how do you see this, or do you take him to even have a claim about enabling conditions or not?
I don't think that, I think that it follows from saying, yes, there is a more multilinear account of historical trajectories in Marx's later work, that there would then be multiple sets of enabling conditions. I think that's right. And that's why, I pointed out toward the end of the paper that in one of these drafts of the letter, the famous letter to Vera Sazulich, Marx reiterates that there is some sort of historical inevitability to the process he's talking about, but he limits the scope of it. So that to Western Europe, right? So that already suggests kind of what you're saying. But I guess, and here's maybe where I think there's, I was really struck listening to Rahel's paper, like how much overlap in this sort of setups there was. But then I think if I understood what she was saying, her concern is a lot more about necessity, actually. And mine is much, or maybe it's both about necessity and progress. But anyway, mine is really focusing on progress, because I take it at least because I'm starting from like what kind of reading, what kind of account of Marx's view would be responsive to this type of critique. I take it that's really the controversial point.
Christian Schmidt.
Thank you so much for reminding us of Chakrabarty's critique and Kevin Anderson's response. My question is, what is really at stake here? What's the problem? So in one of your answers, you already said it's about a theodicy. So it's like at stake is that Marx might be complicit in imperialist endeavors and kind of arguing for subjugation in the name of progress. When I remember one of Chakrabarty's talks, he had a different story. So he told us that when subaltern studies started, the problem was that there were all these Indian Marxists trying to make sense of the situation in India and couldn't, because the framework wasn't just appropriated. This would be a very different problem, so especially with the outlook. So they didn't have the problem that they didn't know where to go to. It was more the problem that how to come to terms with the situation they are in with the intellectual framework they had learned via this Marxist concept. So I'm wondering, are these two problems, or is one of them more important? And if you stick with the theodicy, why is it so important that, as you quoted yourself, Marx rejects the view, and especially if he looks at the situation in Ireland, he says, colonialism is not bringing any good to the colonized anymore. So he might have had this view for some time, but then he gave it up, obviously. So why we are still haunted by this particular problem and not by the other one?
I think I take your point about Chakrabarty, I mean, I guess can't speak for him, obviously, but as I read him, I think one problem that he's very concerned about is the extent to which a Marxist account, a kind of like traditional, let's say, Marxist account is applicable to understanding Indian history. And that makes sense because, of course, he's a historian. So, he's got the historical issues kind of front and center. But at the same time, I mean, Chakrabarty also repeatedly points out this other problem, which I would describe as a more political / normative problem. It's not a question of how apt the description is. It's a question of to what extent certain understandings of modernity and progress end up positioning subaltern subjects as inferior, as he says, human embodiments of the principle of anachronism, as confined to the waiting room of history. I mean, there are all these images in Chakrabarty's work that I think where it's clear that part of what he's concerned about goes beyond how applicable Marxist categories are to the Indian history. So I take it there are at least two problems there in Chakrabarty too, even if he might himself say he's more concerned about the historical problem. I think I'm more interested in what I would call the political / normative problem. And then in response to the question of, was the second question what's at stake, or was the first question what's at stake? I'm sorry, I'm losing. What's at stake is the second question. Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess I think that, it matters, like one could say, what does it matter whether Marx had a problematic Eurocentric theory of history because he offered this great, important critique of colonialism and imperialism? Yeah. I don't find that response that satisfying. I mean, I think it's true, and that the Marxist critique of imperialism is an important tradition. And, as Chakrabarty acknowledges that Marxism was very important for the formation of anti-colonial thought in India and other places. But I think there are different ways to go about critiquing imperialism and colonialism, and, a version that continually helps itself to ideas of primitivity and backward, peoples seems problematic to me. So I'm searching for another way of thinking about the way that we can understand the relationship between capitalism and colonialism and imperialism that doesn't get stuck in what seems to me a bit of a problem there.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to just probably continue that line of inquiry, because I just ask myself, this trajectory of kind of getting out of this Eurocentric perspective, and because I really like your formulation of Marxism as an epistemically imperialist critique of imperialism, right? But I feel like somehow we still are stuck in this kind of perspective, because if we just because we cannot just look at this thing and then say, well, we have to get rid of it, because when we get rid of it, we kind of ignore that there's this huge tradition, as you mentioned, by especially Eastern Marxism, who really started from this critique of traditional life in China, Maoism, right? Also this critique that you quoted from Marx is basically what the Naxalite revolution says in India, right? And so I kind of see the point that when we kind of throw that out, we kind of go back to this Eurocentric perspective, where we just say, well, you can't say that because that would be kind of Eurocentric, but that would be kind of a weird perspective, right? So I wonder what you make out of that.
Sorry, since we are already running out of time, I don't know, do you grant us a couple of more minutes? Then I would just group the questions, and actually we were switching so it was actually this guy behind you who was whom I expected to get the mic.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering about your thinking on development, is because like Koei Saito, for example, has an interesting point of different things developing and some things regressing, like in wealth. There's commonwealth, like for example, you can have people who get more wealthy and have a car, and at the same time the whole city is filled with smoke. So a commonwealth is kind of impoverished, right? At the same time as the one thing is developed, the one declines. So there's a like multi-dimensional thinking on development, which is already present also in Marx. When it comes to Grundrisse, he talks about the anatomy of the ape and of the human, but he also says like different things become more pronounced in one society and some things become less pronounced. So I was wondering, not the multilinear path, but the multi-dimensional path of his historical account, and what the connection is there to his statement of the universally applicable categories of political economy. He kind of thinks if you grasp them and give a critique, you can understand backwards the other other historical periods better. So I was wondering the relation there.
Okay, so now Marvin and Sabina. Sorry, just
Hi.
short questions.
I try to be short. Yeah, thank you so much. I was wondering what could be another positive. Oh, this is not so good here. What could be another positive gain from Marx? And I was trying in my head to link your critique of Marx here to your thoughts in the two books, The End of Progress and The Critique on the Couch. And as I took you to suggest there, critical theory should return to Foucault, Adorno, and Klein, to a method of problematizing genealogy, and in the end it should contribute to a certain kind of reparation. And I was thinking, what could Marx in a way contribute here? And I was reminded of a thought that was very prominent in Freudo-Marxism, which was that there's a structural analogy between psychoanalysis being a certain practice in which conflicts can be acted out, reparation can take place, and so on. And with Marx, society as a whole, as a subject, class struggle is the practice, offers the conditions of reparation in a way of working through. I was wondering if maybe adding Marx to your arguments in the other books, maybe Marx's crucial contribution could be that class struggle in the end would be the central condition for societies working through their contradictions.
Sabina?
Yeah, thanks so much for this. Yeah, everyone know already. So I was wondering if you could say more about the concept of multilinearity. So, when I was listening, it occurred to me that there's sort of two possible ways of understanding that. So one, that there's sort of multiple fixed narratives that are sort of going on at the same time, but they're fixed, or one on which they're sort of hypothetical, they can develop in different ways. And so which, do you see Marx as sort of committed more to one or to the other? It sounded more like you see him kind of stressing inevitability and sort of the fixed, so there's sort of different timelines, but there's sort of each one is equally fixed in some way. So do you see him as being committed to that? Do you ultimately see him as, do you think that we can get some sort of forward-looking account of progress from Marx at the end of the day? Or are you just not sure?
I can help to add another very short question.
I already don't plan for any of them. Go ahead.
Very short. What's wrong with historicism? If it would be multilinear, if it wouldn't be dismissive of other societies, if it would work on a, let's not on the synchronic, but on the diachronic level. One society analyzing and criticizing its own history and its path. I mean, I do understand that you work within that. I mean, that was not the topic of the paper because it's within this framework of this critique. But just in order to open it up, what would then be wrong with it?
Okay, I don't even know where to start, but thank you for all of the questions, and I will take them back and think about them all, if I can't answer them all right now. I think I'll start with Sabina. I mean, yes, I think for me, I understand multilinearity more in terms of multiplicity, not contingency so much. I mean, I'm actually not that, I don't think Marx was a determinist or a fatalist or anything like that. I think those readings are, not that convincing. So, because even if you don't get into all of what it sounds like were complex discussions that have already been had here about enabling conditions and so on, like it's clear that, whatever is going on with the development of the forces of production, it requires the agency of, revolutionary actors to like bring about the transformation that he's talking about. So I don't think that he's historical determinist in any kind of straightforward sense, but I think it's going too far, and one does see this some in these revisionist readings of Marx, like Tomba, for example, whose book I think is really good, but tries to say, oh, his accounts can, there's contingency there. I think that's too strong of a reading, actually, just in terms of what's going on in the text. I mean, if you're talking about, Benjamin or Bloch or Althusser or some of the other, theorists who are informing, I think, Tomba's work, then that's different. But to this question over here about how to bring Marx into my grand, theoretical system, I mean, I love that. That's great. I don't have a grand theoretical system, so I haven't really honestly thought that much about. I mean, I have thought about how, this project fits with some of my other stuff, but it's mainly on the theme of trying to think through, further about the idea of progress and how to articulate a critique of capitalism, which is obviously urgently needed, but without then, getting caught up in some of the philosophical historical logics, I think, that are still in Marx's view. So then I guess that might take me to the first question, which is, I think there are important resources for that project, some in the European Marxist tradition, for sure, but also in certain global Marxist traditions, you might say. But I'm not sure, I mean, it might also be the case that some of those theorists and activists who were most interested in applying Marx's work in a global context were themselves actually more orthodox about the theory of history than Marx himself was in the end. And I'm interested in, looking at some non-European Marxist thinkers like decolonial Marxism in Enrique Dussels' work and Black Marxism, and particularly in the work of Du Bois. But I don't think that I would I mean, I'm not saying we would throw out all of these movements or something. I don't even know what that means. But I'm saying what we're looking for is theoretical resources that are promising for kind of thinking through this question. I would be looking not to Mao, I guess, necessarily, but to, some of these other figures that I mentioned. The last thing I would say in response to Rahel is I take it that the problem of historicism is that there is some kind of claim about all of history being made there. So the idea is that I've suggested at the very end of the paper is that even though Marx, embraces multilinearity, maybe there's a way in which a kind of unity or universality kind of comes back in the end. And if what we were talking about is totally local, contextual judgments about what might constitute progress or not in a particular context, I don't have an objection to that. I don't think that's historicism, though, either. But I also don't think that's Marx's mature view, and I don't think it's Yegi's either, but I'd like to know.
Okay, thank you so much. It's getting hotter and hotter.